Chapter 1. Deadline London, November 1934. Fleet Street at midnight has a quality unlike Fleet Street at any other hour. During the day it is theatre. Printers, reporters, editors, compositors, all moving with the purposeful speed of people who understand that the world pauses for no one and that the deadline is not a suggestion but a law of the universe as absolute as gravity. In the evening it quiets, but not entirely. The evening papers have gone to press, the morning papers are being assembled, and somewhere in every building on the street the presses are running, the ink is flowing, the paper is moving, and tomorrow's version of the truth is being manufactured with the industrial efficiency of something that has been doing this for 100 years. But at midnight, for perhaps an hour, Fleet Street rests. The compositors go home. The reporters file their last copy. The editors, those last survivors of the working day, read the final proofs, make their final decisions, and prepare to leave. For 1 hour, the street belongs to its own silence and to the particular quality of darkness that exists only in places where a great deal of light has recently been. The Criterion Press building stood at the eastern end of Fleet Street, 10 stories of Edwardian stone and purpose, home to the London Chronicle for 42 years. Its facade had been cleaned in 1928 and was clean still, which gave it, among its less well-maintained neighbours, the slightly aggressive quality of a man in a good suit at a party where nobody else has dressed. Hercule Poirot arrived at the Criterion Press building at 12:15 in the morning. He summoned from his flat in Whitehaven Mansions by a telephone call from Inspector Arthur Wells of Scotland Yard, who had managed in the space of 90 seconds to convey both the facts of the situation and the quality of his own disturbance about those facts. "Editor-in-chief," Wells had said. "Top floor. Someone's killed him with his own letter opener. There are photographs everywhere, and there's a letter, addressed to you, Poirot, posted 3 days ago and only just delivered apparently, because the Royal Mail had a strike." The letter was in Poirot's breast pocket as he stepped out of the taxicab onto the pavement. He had read it 4 times since Wells had telephoned, which had taken approximately 12 minutes, which meant he had read it once every 3 minutes, which was an unusual frequency even for Poirot and indicated that the letter was yielding something different on each reading. "Dear Monsieur Poirot, if you receive this after my death, then what I have feared has occurred. At the Chronicle there is a story, the most important story this newspaper has ever held, that certain people in this city will commit any act to prevent from being published. The photographs on my desk are evidence of what those people have done and are doing. But the photographs are not everything. Find the negative. The negative is the truth entire, and it is where only a man who reads carefully will think to look. Yours, in hope and some considerable trepidation, Reginald Ashworth Poirot stepped into the lobby of the Criterion Press building, where Inspector Wells was waiting with the expression of a man who had hoped for a straightforward burglary and received instead something considerably more demanding. "The letter," said Wells as greeting. "The letter," agreed Poirot. He looked around the lobby. Marble floors, the Chronicle's masthead in brass above the reception desk, the smell of ink and paper that permeated the entire building like a second atmosphere. Where is he? The top-floor office of Reginald Ashworth was a room that announced its occupant's authority in the specific language of accumulated objects, not expensive objects, not decorative objects, but functional ones whose accumulation over 40 years had produced a kind of geology of a working life. Filing cabinets with handwritten labels. Bookshelves arranged not by subject but by frequency of consultation. A desk of impressive dimensions that had supported, by the look of it, the weight of several thousand decisions. Ashworth was in his chair. He had been struck once from behind with the letter opener that now lay on the floor to the left of the desk. A long, heavy brass instrument of the old-fashioned kind. The kind that had been a common weapon of opportunity in editorial offices since the profession began. He had died quickly, the police surgeon said. He had not suffered. On the desk, and this was what had prompted Wells to use the word everywhere in his telephone call, were photographs. Perhaps 30 of them, spread across the surface of the desk with the abandon of papers that have been searched through in haste. They were black and white, printed on the heavy stock of professional photography, and they showed various people in various situations. And Poirot stood over them for 4 minutes without touching them, looking at each one with the specific quality of attention that he brought to all evidence, complete, patient, systematic. "One is missing," he said. Wells looked at him. "How can you tell? There are 30-odd photographs." "There are 30 photographs," said Poirot. "They are numbered in pencil on the reverse. I can see the reverse of several through the gaps between others. The sequence runs from 1 to 31. Number 19 is not present." He straightened. "Someone took photograph number 19 before the police arrived."
"Was someone who knew what number 19 showed?" He looked at the half-written editorial still in the typewriter, the last thing Ashworth had been doing before whoever it was had come through the door. The editorial was headed, in Ashworth's own typescript, "The Truth They Don't Want You to Know." Beneath the heading, 4 paragraphs had been completed. The 5th paragraph had been begun and abandoned mid-sentence, the typewriter keys having received their last instruction and maintained it. The last complete sentence read, "In 1929, 4 men in positions of considerable public trust made arrangements with a foreign financial interest that violated both the letter and the spirit of 3 separate Acts of Parliament and this newspaper." And then the sentence stopped, and Reginald Ashworth had stopped with it.
Poirot stepped back from the desk. He looked at the room, the photographs, the editorial, the letter opener on the floor, the brass fittings of the filing cabinets catching the electric light. He looked at the window which faced the street below, where Fleet Street lay in its midnight stillness. "Inspector Wells," he said, "Reginald Ashworth knew he was going to be killed. He sent me that letter 3 days ago. He arranged, in advance, the manner in which the truth could be recovered after his death." He paused. "Which means that whatever is in this room, whatever is missing from this room, it was expected to be missing. The negative he mentioned in his letter is not among the photographs on the desk. It was never among the photographs on the desk. Then where is it?" Poirot looked at the bookshelves, at the filing cabinets.
"At the desk, at 40 years of a man's professional life, arranged in the room where that life had ended. That," he said, "is where we begin." He smoothed his moustaches. "Tell me who was in this building tonight, every person, and begin with the night watchman." Outside, Fleet Street's midnight silence continued for a few minutes more. Then, somewhere below, a press began to run, the early morning edition finding its rhythm, and the building filled again with the sound of the world being explained to itself, 1 page at a time. Chapter 2. The Room Where News is Made. The night watchman's name was Thomas Grint, and he had the bearing of a man who had spent 20 years in a profession that required him to see nothing, hear nothing, and remember nothing, and who had consequently developed a very comprehensive memory and a very selective willingness to share it. He was 56, broad, with a face that had the specific quality of outdoor roughness, even though he spent his nights indoors, and he sat across from Poirot in the Criterion's ground-floor security room, with his hands flat on his knees and the expression of a man who is deciding, with some care, how much the situation requires of him. "You were on duty from 10 o'clock last evening," said Poirot. "The building closes to non-staff at 9. After 9, admission requires your personal authorization or the authorization of a senior editor. Is that correct?" "That's correct," said Grint. "And between 10 and midnight, how many people entered or left the building?" "Standard staff movement," said Grint. "Mr.
To Crow, Stanley Crow, the chief reporter, left at 10:30. Miss Brand from the photo desk left at 20 to 11. Mrs. Prentice from accounts left at 11. He paused. "And Miss Holt?" "Miss Vera Holt, Mr. Ashworth's secretary? She left at 11:15. Usually leaves earlier. Last night she stayed late." He paused again,
And in the pause was the particular quality of a man who has something else to say and is conducting a rapid internal negotiation about whether to say it. She seemed not herself when she left, upset about something. And before she left, between 10 and 11:15, did anyone else enter the building? The negotiation behind Grint's eyes reached its conclusion. "One other person," he said. "A gentleman. Came at 11, left at 11:30. He wasn't on the regular list." Another pause. "He gave me £20. £20, said Poirot. He did not say it with judgment, with the flat neutrality of a man for whom the information is interesting rather than surprising. "His name?" Grint looked at his hands. "I didn't ask. He didn't give it." "Can you describe him?" The description that followed was of a man of perhaps 50, well-dressed, silver-haired, with the manner, Grint searched for the word, the manner of a man who was used to being obeyed. A tall man. A man who walked as though the corridor had been built to his specifications. Poirot nodded once. He produced from his breast pocket a small photograph, not one of the photographs from the desk upstairs, but one he had found in a copy of Who's Who in his flat before leaving. He placed it on the table.
Is this the man?" Grint looked at it for 3 seconds. "Yes," he said. The photograph showed Lord Desmond Fitch, Conservative Member of Parliament for the constituency of East Wiltshire, photographed at a charity function the previous spring. Poirot picked up the photograph, thanked Grint with the specific courtesy he extended to people who had decided, under some difficulty, to tell the truth, and went upstairs. He found Inspector Wells in the editorial floor's large open newsroom, the room that served as the working centre of the Chronicle's daily production, a vast space of desks and typewriters and wire baskets and the accumulated detritus of a newspaper's working life. Wells was speaking to a woman of perhaps 35 who had the composed, watchful quality of someone who processes a great deal of visual information professionally and had been processing this particular situation since she arrived. Miss Cecily Brand, photo editor of the London Chronicle, had been called back to the building at Wells's request and had arrived with the promptness of someone who had been expecting the call since, as she told Poirot when they were introduced, approximately 9:30 the previous evening. "I should have called the police last night," she said. "I knew something was wrong." "Tell me," said Poirot. She had been working late in the darkroom. The Chronicle's photographic darkroom occupied a room off the editorial floor, fitted with its red light and its chemical trays and the specific smell of developer and fixer that those who worked in it ceased to notice entirely. She had been printing contact sheets for a feature running in the following Tuesday's edition when she heard someone in the room adjacent to the darkroom, the negative storage room, where the original glass and celluloid negatives were filed in numbered envelopes on wooden shelving. "The door was slightly open. The catch is loose, it never closes properly. I could hear someone going through the shelves, moving envelopes, putting them back." She paused. "And then I heard them stop. And then I heard a sound I couldn't identify. Something being put in a pocket, perhaps. A flat, hard sound." "You did not look?" "I looked, through the gap in the door." She met Poirot's gaze steadily. "I saw a man's back. He was at the shelf marked Current, Political. He was holding something." "He left before I could see his face." "And what did you do?" "I went to the shelf. I looked at what was there. The envelope for the number 19 negative was there. The envelope was there, but it was empty. The negative was gone." She paused. "I should have called someone immediately. Instead, I made a duplicate print from the contact sheet, which I had already made earlier in the day, and I hid it." "Where?" said Poirot. She produced it from her cardigan pocket. A small photographic print, the paper slightly chemical smelling, the image clear and detailed. She handed it to Poirot with the care of someone handing over something that has cost them something. Poirot looked at the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. Then he placed it in his breast pocket alongside Ashworth's letter. "Miss Brand," he said. "You showed considerable presence of mind." "Mr. Ashworth told me once," she said quietly, "that a photograph is only as useful as its negative. that the negative is the truth and the print is only the evidence. He said, if you ever need to protect something important, protect the negative, not the print. She paused. I understood him to mean it literally in that moment. I think now he may have meant something larger. Poirot nodded. He looked around the newsroom, at the desks with their typewriters, the wire baskets, the boards with their running lists of stories in progress, at the machinery, physical and human, by which the world was daily translated into print. I should like, he said to Wells, to speak to Miss Vera Holt and to Oliver Ashworth, the deputy editor, and I should like, before I speak to either of them,
to spend 20 minutes alone in Reginald Ashworth's office. Looking for the negative, said Wells. Looking for what Ashworth wanted me to find, said Poirot, which is not quite the same thing. A man who sends a letter in advance of his death is a man who has arranged something very carefully. He was not a careless man. The hiding place will be logical to a man who read carefully, who used words precisely, who understood that every phrase has a meaning, and that meaning, properly understood, is always sufficient. He went up the stairs toward the top floor.
And as he went, he was already thinking about the word negative, about its photographic meaning and its grammatical meaning and its logical meaning, and what a man who had spent 40 years choosing words would intend by it when he had very little time and very little paper, and a great deal to convey. Chapter 3. The Secretary's Silence. Miss Vera Holt lived in a flat in Clerkenwell, not far from the newspaper district, in one of those streets of modest Victorian terraces that London had been producing since the 1870s, in the apparent belief that the supply of modest Victorian terraces could never outstrip the demand. Poirot arrived at 9 in the morning, having slept for 3 hours, and was admitted to a flat that was clean, orderly, and inhabited by a person who had spent the night not sleeping. Miss Holt's eyes had the specific quality of a face that has been composed for visitors after hours of something it is still trying to contain. She was 41, plain in the manner of women who have spent a long time not thinking about whether they are plain, with careful hands and an efficient way of moving that suggested a professional life in which precision was valued. She had been Reginald Ashworth's personal secretary for 10 years. Poirot had been informed by several people in the previous 8 hours, indispensable to him. "You know why I'm here," said Poirot. "Yes," she said. "You were in the building last night until 11:15. "Yes." "You left in a distressed condition, according to the night watchman." A pause. She looked at her hands. Her hands were, Poirot noticed, entirely still, the stillness of someone who is controlling them consciously rather than being naturally still. "I was upset," she said. "Mr. Ashworth and I had a disagreement about the editorial, about what he was planning to publish." "What was the nature of the disagreement?" "I told him it was dangerous. I told him he should reconsider, that there were—" She stopped. "That there were other ways to proceed, that going to the police or to a solicitor might be more appropriate than publishing." He disagreed. He said the press was the only appropriate instrument for public accountability. He said the law was too slow and too corruptible, and that the story had to be told in public and immediately, where it could not be buried. She paused. He was right. He was always right about the press.
It was one of the things— She stopped again. Poirot waited. "It was one of the things I admired about him," she said, with the quality of someone completing a sentence that has taken 10 years to be worth finishing. "Miss Holt," said Poirot gently, "you were outside his office at approximately 11 o'clock last evening. You heard voices." The stillness of her hands became briefly absolute. Then, "Yes, tell me," she told him, in the precise, ordered manner of a woman who had spent 10 years recording other people's words and understood the importance of accuracy. She had been in the corridor outside the editor's office at 11 o'clock, having finished their disagreement and gone to collect her coat from the adjacent small room that served as her own office. She had stood in the corridor for some minutes, not because she intended to listen, she said, with the specific care of someone establishing this clearly, but because she was composing herself before the walk to the lift. She had heard Ashworth's voice, speaking to someone firmly with the specific quality of firmness he used when he had made a decision and was explaining why it was final. She had heard another voice, lower. She could not distinguish the words "a man's voice" with the quality of someone accustomed to having lower voices be sufficient. And then a silence that was different from the previous silences in the conversation. A silence with a quality to it that she could not articulate precisely, but that had caused her, she said, to feel cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the corridor.
"And you left," said Poirot. "I left," she said. And then, very quietly, I think I knew, and I left anyway. And I have been sitting with that since midnight." Poirot looked at her for a moment. This woman who had spent 10 years being indispensable to a man, and 6 hours being indispensable to a guilt that was not, strictly speaking, deserved. "You could not have saved him," said Poirot. "The man who was in that office was not there to negotiate. He had made his decision before he arrived. If you had remained in the corridor, you would have been a witness, which would have made you a problem. And the man who killed Reginald Ashworth was in the business of eliminating problems with considerable efficiency." He paused. "You are not responsible for what happened.
But you may be very useful in resolving it." She looked at him with the expression of someone receiving something they are not certain they have the right to. "The voice," said Poirot. "You said you could not distinguish words, but the quality of it, was there anything familiar about it? Not the identity, necessarily. The type." She considered. "It was the voice of someone who is not accustomed to being refused," she said finally. "Not a loud voice, not an aggressive voice in the ordinary sense, but a voice that assumed compliance and was encountering, for perhaps the first time, its absence." She paused. "I have heard that quality in voices before. It belongs to a specific kind of man." "Yes," said Poirot. "It does." He rose. "One more question. In 10 years with Mr. Ashworth, did he ever mention a dictionary?"
"A specific dictionary, kept in his office?" She looked at him sharply. Something moved across her face. Recognition, quickly examined, carefully tested. "His Chambers," she said. "The large Chambers English Dictionary, 1903 edition. He said his father gave it to him when he started at his first newspaper. He said a man who claims to understand words and does not own a proper dictionary is a man who doesn't entirely mean what he says." Was it on the shelf in his office? She thought. It was always on the shelf. I haven't looked since last night. She paused. Is that where he put it? "I believe so," said Poirot. "I shall know in an hour." He thanked her. He went down the stairs to the street, where the November morning was conducting its grey and purposeful business, and where the Chronicle delivery vans were moving through the traffic, carrying the morning edition to the stands of a city that was still, as yet, entirely unaware of what had happened in its most famous newspaper's building the previous night. That would change. The question was what version of events would reach the public first. The managed version, or the version that Reginald Ashworth had spent 3 days carefully arranging to survive his own death. Chapter 4. The Sun and the Newspaper. Oliver Ashworth had moved into his father's office by the time Poirot returned to the Criterion Press building at 10 o'clock, which was, Poirot reflected, a rapid piece of territorial administration for a man whose father had been dead for less than 12 hours. He was 38. It is with his father's build but none of his father's stillness, a man in constant, slightly unnecessary motion, straightening things on the desk, rearranging papers, performing the actions of occupation in the manner of someone who is not entirely certain the occupation is secure. He was deputy editor in title and had been deputy editor in practice for 4 years, meaning he had spent 4 years in the specific position of a man who does much of the work and holds none of the authority and is aware of both facts simultaneously. "My father's death is a tragedy," he said as Poirot sat down. "A professional tragedy as well as a personal one. The Chronicle will not be the same without him." "No," agreed Poirot, "it will not." He looked at the desk, at the objects his father had kept on it for 40 years. Be now marginally displaced by their new occupant's initial administration. "You were not in the building last night?"
I left at 6. I had a dinner engagement. The engagement can be confirmed? Entirely. He named a club in Pall Mall and 3 members who had dined with him. I heard the news at 1 in the morning when Wells telephoned. I came immediately. Of course. Poirot looked at him pleasantly. Your father's editorial, the one he was writing when he died. You were aware of it? A beat. I was aware he was working on something significant. He didn't discuss the specifics with me. He didn't discuss with you that he intended to publish an account of a financial scandal involving Lord Desmond Fitch and 3 other prominent figures? The beat this time was longer. Not long enough to be evasion, but long enough to be calculation. Father had various investigations ongoing at any given time. I couldn't always keep track. You are deputy editor, said Poirot mildly. Surely, Father ran the Chronicle as he saw fit. He always had. My title was, it described a function rather than a level of involvement in editorial decisions. He stopped. He was an extraordinary editor. Extraordinary men tend to run things their own way. Poirot absorbed this. He looked at Oliver Ashworth, at the motion, the displacement, the administration of a desk that was being made his. Lord Fitch, said Poirot. Do you know him personally? We've met at various press events, dinners. And Lord Fitch has been a significant advertiser in the Chronicle for many years. A significant advertiser whose continued advertising would be considerably in your interest now that the newspaper passes to you. Oliver Ashworth's eyes narrowed very slightly. I'm not certain what you're implying. I am not implying anything, said Poirot, with the specific pleasantness of a man who is implying everything. I am establishing the landscape of relationships. In cases of this kind, understanding who knows whom, and in what capacity, and with what financial implications is always useful. He rose. One question. The negative storage room on the editorial floor. Do you have access to it? All senior editorial staff have access. It's not secured. The key is kept at the main editorial desk. And you were deputy editor for 4 years. So you would have been considered senior editorial staff throughout that period? Yes. Thank you. Poirot moved toward the door. I am sorry for your loss, Mr. Ashworth. I hope you will find running the newspaper, in whatever manner you choose to run it, more comfortable than you perhaps anticipate. He went to the shelf beside the window, the shelf that held the reference books, the style guides, the accumulated linguistic authority of 40 years of editorial decisions, and he took down the large Chambers English Dictionary, 1903 edition, its spine worn with the specific wear of a book that has been consulted rather than displayed. He opened it. He riffled the pages. Between pages 847 and 848, between the entries for negative and negligence, a glass photographic negative was held in a small paper envelope. The envelope sealed with a strip of adhesive tape on which Ashworth had written in his precise editorial hand, "For Monsieur Poirot, the truth entire." Poirot removed it carefully. He held it to the window light. The image was a small, perhaps 3 inches by 4, but the detail, as befitted a professional photograph taken by a professional photographer, was exact. He could see the faces. He could read, or nearly read, the document on the table before the central figure. He placed the negative in his breast pocket with the care of a man depositing something of considerable weight, which was what it was. Behind him, Oliver Ashworth said nothing. When Poirot turned, the man was watching him with an expression that contained several things simultaneously, and Poirot, reading them with the fluency of long practice, identified them. Surprise, decalculation, and, underneath both, something that wasn't grief but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man who has known something bad was coming and has found, now that it has arrived, that knowing did not make it better. "Good morning," said Poirot, and left. Chapter 5. The Politician's Breakfast. Lord Desmond Fitch received Poirot at his house in Eaton Square at 11:30, in a breakfast room that managed to be both comfortable and impressive, in the specific manner of rooms used for the informal entertainment of important people.
He was 53, silver-haired, with the broad, confident physicality of a man who had rowed at Oxford and had maintained the posture, if not the precise condition, of that achievement across 3 subsequent decades. He wore a morning coat with the ease of a man for whom formal dress was not an imposition but an environment, and he offered Poirot coffee with the hospitality of someone who understood that hospitality is a form of control. "A terrible business," he said. "Reginald Ashworth, a great editor, one of the last of the old school." He shook his head with the specific gravity of a public man performing public sorrow. "The police are treating it as a robbery gone wrong, I understand?" "The police are treating it as a murder," said Poirot pleasantly. "The robbery theory was discarded within the first hour. Nothing of value was taken from the office." "Ah," a pause. "Well, these things are always more complicated than they first appear." "Almost always," agreed Poirot. He accepted the coffee. He looked around the breakfast room, at the silver on the sideboard, the family portraits on the walls, the particular quality of accumulated establishment that Eaton Square houses produced as naturally as other houses produced drafts. "Lord Fitch, you were at the Criterion Press Building last night, at 11 o'clock. The quality of Lord Fitch's relaxation did not change. This was, Poirot noted, itself informative. It was the relaxation of a man who has already accounted for the eventuality of this question, not the relaxation of a man who has nothing to account for. "I visited the building, yes. I had a business matter to discuss with Ashworth, an advertising matter. Our contract was due for renewal, and I wanted to speak to him personally." "At 11 o'clock in the evening?" "I had been in the house until 10. Ashworth worked late. It seemed a natural time." "And the conversation? The advertising matter?" "We discussed it, reached some preliminary understanding. I left at about 11:30. He smiled, the comfortable smile of a man whose story is prepared. "I was, I believe, the last person to see him alive, which I imagine is why you're here." "You were in the building from 11 to 11:30, said Poirot. "Reginald Ashworth died at approximately 11 o'clock, based on the police surgeon's estimate, which means our conversation was somewhat briefer than I indicated," said Lord Fitch, without the smile changing at all. "I arrived, we spoke, I left. The precise timing is difficult to establish with certainty." "The night watchman noted your arrival at 11 and your departure at 11:30, said Poirot. 30 minutes. Long enough to have a discussion, long enough to search a desk." He set down his coffee cup. "The photographs on the desk. I have no idea what photographs you mean." "Number 19 was taken from the desk before the police arrived. The negative for number 19 was removed from the negative storage room at some point during the evening." Poirot looked at Lord Fitch with the mild, steady gaze that had unsettled a great many people over a long career. "You know what number 19 showed?" A silence, not the prepared silence of earlier, but a different kind, with different furniture in it. "I was photographed at a meeting in 1929, said Lord Fitch. "A business meeting. The meeting had nothing improper about it. But the people present at that meeting have since been... The meeting has acquired an unfortunate retrospective appearance given subsequent events. The financial scandal of 1929, said Poirot, in which funds were moved between London accounts and a German financial entity through channels that violated parliamentary statute, in which 4 prominent figures were involved, in which Reginald Ashworth suppressed the story at the time in exchange for," he paused, "certain considerations." "I don't know what you mean by considerations." "The continued placement of advertising in the Chronicle at a rate considerably above market value for a period of 5 years, said Poirot. "I have spoken to the newspaper's accounts department this morning. The mathematics are not subtle." He rose. "And now Ashworth wished to publish the story. Because the considerations had ceased, and because he had, I think, arrived at the end of a career in which he wished to close certain accounts." Lord Fitch said nothing. "You went to persuade him not to publish," said Poirot. "He refused. In the subsequent conversation, the conversation that Miss Vera Holt heard from the corridor outside, the conversation she will describe in her formal statement to Inspector Wells this afternoon, the conversation became something else." He picked up his hat.
The letter opener was on the desk. It was a heavy instrument. You were standing behind him. "I want to speak to my solicitor," said Lord Fitch. "That is entirely your right," said Poirot. "Inspector Wells will be here within the hour."
I suggest you use the intervening time to prepare a complete and accurate account rather than the prepared one you have been using this morning. In my experience, the complete account is always less costly in the long run than the prepared one. He went out through the breakfast room, through the hall, out into Eaton Square, where November was conducting its grey operations with the indifference of a month that has no investment in how things turn out. He had the negative. He had Grint's identification. He had Vera Holt's account of the voices. He had the financial records from accounts. He did not yet have the second piece of the picture, the piece that concerned Stanley Crowe and a gas valve and an open window. But he had begun to see its shape, and the shape was not unexpected, and he was already, as he walked toward the taxicab rank on the corner of the square, composing the question he needed to ask next. Chapter 6. The Reporter Who Knew Too Much. Stanley Crowe was found at 7:15 on the morning of the third day by his landlady, who had gone upstairs to complain about a smell. The smell was gas. The window of his first-floor flat in Islington was open, a sash window, raised approximately 6 inches, which the landlady had assumed accounted for the smell's presence in the stairwell. Inside, Crowe was in his armchair. The gas ring on the kitchen stove was turned off. The window admitted the November air with the efficiency of something that had been opened specifically to ventilate a space that had previously been sealed. Inspector Wells telephoned Poirot at 7:45. Poirot was already dressed. He arrived at the Islington flat at 8:15 and went through it with the methodical attention of a man who has been told what the conclusion is and is working backward to understand the argument. The conclusion that Stanley Crowe, aged 44, chief reporter of the London Chronicle, had died of gas asphyxiation in circumstances arranged to suggest accident was one he had been expecting in the general sense since the previous morning, when he had understood the shape of what was happening. The specific manner and timing were new information, and new information properly examined always yielded more than one expected. The gas ring was on the kitchen stove. It was turned off.
But the smell in the flat was not the smell of a gas ring that had been left on overnight and then turned off. It was the smell of a flat that had been sealed with gas and then ventilated. The difference was subtle but detectable by a nose that had been trained over decades to trust its own impressions. The window was open 6 inches, and the sash cord on the right side of the window had a small mark on it, at the height of a man's hand, where something had gripped it. Not the mark of opening and closing in the ordinary way, but the mark of a hand pulling the window up sharply in a specific motion from outside. It was a ground floor access, the flat being on the first floor, but the building had a fire escape on the rear elevation, and the fire escape passed directly before Crowe's window. There on the writing table beside the armchair, Crowe's working table, covered with the accumulated papers of several current stories, was a file. It was labelled, in Crowe's hand, Ashworth, Final Story. Inside was a draft article, a full account of the 1929 scandal, of the financial arrangements between Lord Fitch and his associates and the German interest, of Ashworth's suppression of the original story and his decision to publish now. It was thorough, clearly evidenced and ready, in the journalist's phrase, to go. And it was why Stanley Crowe was dead. "He told someone he had the draft," said Wells, standing beside Poirot in the flat's sitting room. "Or someone knew he had it." "He told someone he intended to publish it," said Poirot. "In Ashworth's memory, he would have said so. He was that kind of man." He looked at the file. He would have made calls, yesterday, perhaps, or the day before, to verify certain facts, to seek comment from those named in the story. One of those calls reached someone who understood the implications. "Lord Fitch is in custody," said Wells. "He can't have—" "Lord Fitch did not do this," said Poirot. "Lord Fitch killed Ashworth on impulse, or near enough to impulse, in a confrontation that went further than he intended. This He gestured at the arranged flat, the turned-off gas ring, the carefully opened window. "This is different. This is planned. This is a man who thought about it, prepared it, executed it with care, and arranged the aftermath with attention to detail." He paused. "Lord Fitch is an impulsive man in a crisis. The person who killed Stanley Crowe is not." "Then who?" Poirot looked at the writing table. "I sat the file." At the specific, deliberate placement of the file in the exact center of the work surface. Not where Crowe would have left it in the midst of the other papers, but placed there, prominently, for a reason. "Someone who wanted us to find this file," said Poirot. "Not to suppress the story, it's too late for that and they knew it, but to ensure that the story, when it was found, pointed only at Lord Fitch, only at the financial scandal, only at the 1929 matter." He paused. "Because if the investigation focused on Lord Fitch and the old scandal, it would not focus on other things, on other reasons for wanting the Chronicle to stop the story, on other people with other interests in the newspaper's future." He picked up his hat. He looked at the flat one more time, at the arranged death of a man who had been trying to do something decent in his colleague's memory and had been stopped before he could do it. "I need to speak to Mrs. Lydia Ashworth," he said, "and then I need 1 hour with certain financial documents, and then I think we are ready." He went down the fire escape on the building's rear elevation, not because it was the most convenient route, but because he wanted to see what could be seen from the level of Crowe's window, at the specific height at which a man standing on the fire escape could reach a sash cord. What he could see at that height and angle was exactly what he had expected to see, and expected or not, it was not comfortable to look at. Chapter 7. Print and Proof. They gathered in the London Chronicle's main conference room at 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the third day, the room where editorial meetings were held, where the newspaper's direction was debated, where for 40 years Reginald Ashworth had sat at the head of the long table and made the decisions that determined what a city of 8 million people would read with their breakfast. The table was the same, the chairs were the same, the boards on the walls still held the running lists of stories in progress, the room was the same, and the man who had given it its authority for 4 decades was gone, and the difference between the room as it was and the room as it had been was entirely produced by one absence. Inspector Wells sat to Poirot's right. A constable stood by the door. The others arranged themselves in the chairs with the specific care of people who understand that where they sit is being observed. Oliver Ashworth sat at the head of the table. He had been there all day, conducting the newspaper's business, receiving condolences, making the decisions that needed to be made. He sat with the authority of a man who has waited a long time for a chair and has now occupied it and is not certain whether it fits. Lord Fitch wasn't present. He was at Scotland Yard, having declined through his solicitor to make a voluntary statement about the events at the Criterion Press Building on the night of the first day. He would, Poirot had told Wells, remain where he was until the account was complete. Present were Oliver Ashworth, Vera Holt, pale and steady, Cecily Brand, but with the specific composure of someone who has already discharged their most important obligation and is waiting to see the rest. Dr. Felix Morin, the Chronicle's medical columnist, who had been, Poirot had established, at the building on the first night and who had sat for the past 20 minutes with the expression of a man who has reviewed his position and found it less comfortable than he had assumed. Mrs. Lydia Ashworth, the widow, who had arrived with a solicitor and had dismissed the solicitor on the way into the room, which had told Poirot a great deal. Thomas Grint sat in a chair at the side of the room, slightly apart from the others, which was where Poirot had asked him to sit. Poirot stood. 3 days ago, he said, Reginald Ashworth was murdered in this building. 2 days ago, Stanley Crowe was murdered in his flat in Islington. In each case, the mechanism was different. In each case, the motive appears on the surface to be the same, the suppression of a story. And the suppression of that story does, in fact, account for one of the 2 deaths. He paused. But not both. He placed on the table in the centre 3 objects: Ashworth's letter to him in its envelope, the glass negative in its paper envelope, and the photograph that Cecily Brand had made from the contact sheet. Lord Desmond Fitch entered this building on the night of the first day, having been admitted by Thomas Grint in exchange for £20.
He came to persuade Reginald Ashworth not to publish an editorial account of the 1929 financial scandal, a scandal in which Lord Fitch's involvement was comprehensively documented in photographs that Ashworth had been holding for 5 years. Ashworth refused. In the conversation that followed, the conversation overheard by Miss Vera Holt, the confrontation became physical. Lord Fitch struck Ashworth with the letter opener from the desk. He then took photograph number 19, which showed him most clearly, and removed the corresponding negative from the storage room. He paused. He did not know about the duplicate print that Miss Brand had already made, and he did not know about the original negative hidden in the Chambers Dictionary, where Ashworth had placed it specifically for me to find. He looked at Lord Fitch's empty chair. Lord Fitch killed Reginald Ashworth, said Poirot. He will answer for it. He turned. Stanley Crowe died for a different reason at different hands. He looked at Oliver Ashworth. You knew about the financial arrangements between your father and Lord Fitch, said Poirot. You had known for some time, not the details, but the shape, an advertising rate well above market value sustained for 5 years, an editor who did not pursue certain stories that other papers were pursuing. You had the access as deputy editor to observe both without necessarily understanding all of it. He paused. When your father told you 3 weeks ago that he intended to publish the story, to expose Lord Fitch and close the account as he put it, you understood what it meant. Not for the newspaper's integrity. For the newspaper's finances. Oliver Ashworth said nothing. His hands were flat on the table. Lord Fitch's advertising represented 11% of the Chronicle's annual revenue, said Poirot, in a newspaper that was already managing a decline in circulation and an increase in production costs. The withdrawal of that advertising, which would have been Lord Fitch's immediate response to publication, would have forced a restructuring that threatened the paper's independence. He paused. You went to Lord Fitch, not to warn him, to align yourself with him. You told him that your father was going to publish when and in what form. You gave him the opportunity to act. The room was very still. You did not know that he would kill your father, said Poirot. I believe that is true, and it will matter, to some extent, in what follows. You thought he would come and persuade. You thought, perhaps, that the confrontation would be enough to make your father reconsider. You were wrong about what Lord Fitch was prepared to do. He paused. But Stanley Crowe you did know about. When Crowe told you he had the draft and intended to publish, you knew that publication would lead to the investigation that would lead here. And you went to Islington, and you did what you did. Oliver Ashworth looked at his father's table. It will not be enough, he said finally. You can't prove. The mark on the sash cord, said Poirot. The specific angle of entry from the fire escape. The placement of the file. Too careful, too central, placed there by someone who was not Stanley Crowe. And, he paused, the fact that Stanley Crowe telephoned you at 2 in the afternoon of the day before he died. The call is in the exchange records. He told you what he was doing. He thought you would support him. He looked at Oliver Ashworth steadily. He thought you were your father's son. The silence lasted several seconds. Then Wells nodded to the constable, and the constable moved, and the conference room of the London Chronicle began its final transition from a room where a newspaper's future had been decided to a room where something older and more necessary had been, at last, correctly arranged. Chapter 8. The Morning Edition. The Chronicle published its account of the 1929 financial scandal on the morning of the 7th day. 4 days after Oliver Ashworth's arrest, 3 days after Lord Fitch had made his formal statement, 2 days after the Chronicle's board of directors had appointed an acting editor from its senior staff and authorized the publication of the story that Reginald Ashworth had been trying to publish when he was killed. The headline read, "The Truth They Tried to Bury, Published at Last." Poirot read it over his breakfast at Whitehaven Mansions with the composed attention he brought to all morning reading, which was the same attention he brought to everything, complete, systematic, open to what was actually on the page rather than what was expected to be there. The story was well written. It was thorough and evidenced. It was, as Ashworth had predicted it would be, a public accounting that no legal process could have produced with the same speed or the same reach. Whether it was, in the final analysis, worth two men's deaths was a question Poirot set aside as unanswerable in the terms in which it was usually posed. The question assumed a transaction, two lives for one story, and transactions of that kind are always framed by those who benefit from the suppression of what is being weighed. Ashworth had not died for a story. He had been killed by a man who feared a story. Crowe had not died for a principle. He had been killed by a man who feared the consequence of a principle. The story's publication was not the purpose of either death. It was the refusal of those deaths to have their intended effect. Poirot finished his coffee. He put on his coat and hat and walked to Fleet Street. Where the morning was at its industry, delivery vans and compositors, and the particular purposeful noise of a place that produces the world's explanation of itself on a daily schedule that admits no exceptions. He bought a copy of the Chronicle from a boy on the corner and stood on the pavement, reading the front page again, in the street where it had been made, in the noise and motion of a city that consumed its daily information with the appetite of something that had been doing this for a century and intended to continue. Wells found him there at 9 o'clock, as they had agreed. "Fitch's solicitor is already talking about a manslaughter plea," said Wells. "Crime of passion, unpremeditated, extreme provocation. He will not succeed with that argument," said Poirot. "A man who enters a building at 11 at night, having paid the watchman to admit him, having concealed his identity, having made a specific demand, that is not a man acting without premeditation. That is a man who has thought about what he is willing to do and has decided on his threshold." He folded the newspaper. "The jury will see it correctly. And Oliver Ashworth? Oliver Ashworth is a more complicated case because his culpability is of a more complicated kind. He did not kill his father. He facilitated his father's death through an act that he intended to produce a lesser outcome. The law has something to say about that, and it will say it." Poirot paused. "What the law cannot say, and what is perhaps more important, is what it means to betray the thing you were meant to inherit. To be given a newspaper that stood for 40 years on the principle that the truth would be told, and to sell that principle for 11% of annual advertising revenue." He shook his head. "The law will address Oliver Ashworth. History will address him in other terms." "Miss Holt," said Wells. "What happens to her?" "She continues," said Poirot. "She has done nothing wrong. She has been, under difficult circumstances, a person of considerable integrity. She told the truth when it mattered, which is the only test that can reasonably be applied." He paused. "I think she will be all right. Grief of the kind she carries is not, in my experience, a condition that prevents people from functioning. It often, in the end, clarifies things. And Miss Brand? Miss Brand has a future in photography that does not depend on this case, but that this case has illuminated," said Poirot. "She is a woman of notable judgment and no little courage. She will be fine." He looked at Fleet Street, at the buildings, the vans, the noise, the daily industrial production of the world's account of itself. "You know what I find most instructive about this case," he said. "Tell me." Reginald Ashworth knew, 3 days before he died, that he was going to die. He had time to run. He had time to give the story to another paper, to disappear, to protect himself by any number of ordinary means. Poirot looked at the Chronicle building at the far end of the street. He chose instead to prepare, to arrange the evidence, to write a letter, to hide a negative in a dictionary, to ensure that when he was gone, the truth would not be gone with him. He paused. He was not a perfect man. He had suppressed that story once for money and lived with it for 5 years, and the living with it was what drove him to publish in the end. But he understood, finally, what the work was for, and he made certain it would be done, even if he could not do it himself. He put the newspaper under his arm. He smoothed his moustaches. He looked at the street for a moment more. The ink and the motion and the daily noise of a city explaining itself to itself, imperfectly, necessarily, without end. "Come," he said to Wells, "I believe there is a matter of paperwork." They walked up Fleet Street together in the November morning, chat through the particular quality of purpose that the street generated, and that was its own kind of answer to the question of what it was all for. Not a complete answer, not a comfortable one, but the kind that stays with you, which is perhaps the only kind worth having. In the newsagent's window on the corner, the morning's Chronicle headline was still visible. "The truth they tried to bury, published at last." Les petites cellules grises, Poirot reflected, were satisfied, for now.